Biography, Simón Bolívar, Military Commander, South American Liberation and Continental Vision. Part 1, Origins and Formation. In 1783, in Caracas, capital of the Captaincy General of Venezuela, a boy named Simón Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolívar y Palacios was born into one of the wealthiest Creole families in Spanish America, 1783-1830. His birth into privilege coincided with revolutionary ferment spreading across the Atlantic world. The stakes of his life would be immense. Vast South American territories remained locked within Spain's commercial monopoly, their wealth extracted to Madrid, their governance dictated by distant authority. Bolívar's choices would determine whether an entire continent would remain colonial or forge independent republics. Bolívar's family possessed vast landholdings, enslaved laborers, and connections to the colonial bureaucracy. His father, Juan Vicente Bolívar y Ponte, died when Simón was 3 years old, leaving the boy under guardianship of his uncle Carlos Palacios and later his tutor Simón Rodríguez. Rodríguez, a progressive educator influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas about natural education, profoundly shaped the young Bolívar's intellectual formation. The tutor took his charge on extended journeys through Europe beginning around 1799, first to Madrid where Bolívar studied mathematics, languages, and military science. He then traveled to Paris between 1804 and 1806, visiting Italy and other European centers before returning to Venezuela in 1807. In Paris and across Europe, Bolívar encountered Napoleonic reforms and revolutionary principles that shaped his republican ideology. He observed military infrastructure in Spain and administrative systems in Italian territories. Upon returning to Caracas in 1807, Bolívar joined the militia as an officer and witnessed deterioration of Spanish authority in America. The Spanish crown, weakened by Napoleonic wars in Europe, lost effective control over its colonies. In 1810, a movement emerged in Caracas establishing a local governing junta ostensibly loyal to the deposed Spanish King Ferdinand VII but effectively declaring autonomy. Bolívar, aged 27, joined this movement and received a military commission. His mentor Simón Rodríguez and military advisor Cristóbal Mendoza guided his political thinking toward outright independence rather than mere autonomy. When the First Venezuelan Republic collapsed under royalist military pressure in July 1812, Bolívar fled to Cartagena de Indias in present-day Colombia. There he wrote his Manifesto of Cartagena on November 27, 1812, articulating causes of the Republic's failure and outlining strategy for renewed military resistance. This manifesto demonstrated that Bolívar had moved beyond reformist thinking towards systematic republican ideology. It argued that Venezuela's federalist structure had weakened military capacity and that centralized command was necessary for independence. He asserted that the revolution had failed not from external pressure alone but from internal division and weak authority. It contended that decisive, unified military action must replace consensus-seeking deliberation. Rodríguez remained Bolívar's closest intellectual confidant during these formative years, though their relationship would later strain as political and military demands diverged from pedagogical ideals. Cristóbal Mendoza provided military counsel emphasizing continental scope rather than merely Venezuelan liberation. A third influence emerged in José María Espinar, a Spanish officer who provided tactical training in siege warfare and fortification. These three mentors, the idealistic educator, the military advisor, and the professional officer, shaped Bolívar's synthesis of Enlightenment republicanism with military pragmatism. By 1812, Bolívar had articulated the core strategic vision that would guide his subsequent 2 decades, that Spanish-American independence required continental coordination, centralized military command, and ideological commitment to republicanism transcending local particularism. Part 2, Strategy and Impact. Having established himself as military thinker and republican ideologue by late 1812, Bolívar now undertook systematic conquest and unification of territories across northern South America. From his base in Cartagena, he received command of a small expeditionary force from the local patriot government. In 1813, he led approximately 2,000 troops southward into Venezuela in rapid military campaign capturing town after town across the region. These swift movements swelled his forces as enslaved men, indigenous peoples, and marginalized rural populations joined his army. Bolívar decreed freedom for enslaved men who enlisted as soldiers through formal decrees issued in 1814 and 1816, a radical move in slaveholding societies that enlarged his army while destabilizing the social order Spain sought to preserve. However, this policy remained inconsistent, subject to negotiation with slaveholding elites, and did not extend to enslaved women and children. Bolívar's strategic brilliance rested on three core decisions. First, he understood that Spanish America's vast geography required flexible, mobile armies rather than static garrisons defending fixed territories. Second, he recognized that Spanish crown control depended on Creole elite acquiescence. By positioning himself as liberator of all oppressed peoples, including enslaved Africans and indigenous communities, he undermined elite neutrality and forced commitment to independence or Spanish loyalty. Third, he aligned Republican ideology with material interests of military ambition. He promised land, social mobility, and freedom to soldiers and followers, creating armies bound by shared purpose rather than colonial obedience. These strategies proved devastatingly effective against Spanish commanders relying on traditional hierarchies and inherited privilege. Between 1813 and 1815, Bolívar achieved successive military victories across Venezuela and New Granada. Early engagements in 1813 secured control of northern Venezuela, culminating in his entry into Caracas by November 1813. The Caracas Municipal Council formally conferred upon Bolívar the title El Libertador, the Liberator. However, Spanish royalist forces reinforced by troops from the Caribbean and veterans returning from Europe after Napoleon's 1814 defeat counterattacked fiercely. General Pablo Morillo arrived in Venezuela in April 1815 with substantial reinforcements, mounting sustained campaign to suppress patriot movements. By 1815, Bolívar's position had crumbled, and he fled to Jamaica in May 1815. From exile in Jamaica, Bolívar wrote his letter from Jamaica on September 6, 1815, articulating continental vision of independent republics stretching from Venezuela to Argentina. This document, composed while in military defeat and political isolation, demonstrated ideological consistency and long-term strategic thinking. Rather than abandoning his ambitions, Bolívar refined them, writing that Spanish America would inevitably fragment into multiple republics but that these republics required republican constitutionalism and mutual support to resist future European domination. From 1816 onward, Bolívar executed strategic pivot. Rather than holding contested Venezuelan territory, he moved to the Orinoco River region, remote and difficult for Spanish forces to penetrate. It cultivated relationships with powerful military commanders, particularly José Antonio Páez, a llanero or plains warrior commanding cavalry forces in eastern lowlands whose alliance proved essential to military success. Bolívar also secured foreign support, recruiting Irish and British veterans of Napoleonic wars known as the Irish Legion and British Auxiliary Legion, who provided disciplined infantry and tactical expertise. By 1818, his reconstituted army numbered approximately 6,000 troops, including foreign regulars and Venezuelan cavalry. The pivotal turning point came in February 1819 at the Congress of Angostura. Bolívar convened political assembly on the Orinoco River where he was elected president of New Republic. He then executed one of history's most daring military maneuvers. He led approximately 3,000 troops across flooded plains and through Andes Mountains toward New Granada in grueling journey lasting from May to early August 1819. The campaign tested soldiers nearly to destruction, crossing llanos during flooding season then ascending high-altitude Andes where many men perished from exposure and hunger. On August 7, 1819, at the Battle of Boyacá near Tunja, Patriot forces under General Carlos Santander defeated Spanish troops in decisive engagement shattering Spanish control of New Granada's interior. Though Bolívar had planned the campaign strategically, he was recovering from illness and did not command the battle directly. The victory opened path to Bogotá, which Patriot forces occupied shortly thereafter. Bolívar faced determined opposition from Spanish military commanders, particularly General Pablo Morillo who mounted sustained campaign initially achieving substantial gains. However, Spanish crown could not indefinitely sustain distant military operations, and royalist commanders faced desertion as indigenous and enslaved soldiers chose Bolívar's liberation promise over Spanish feudalism. By late 1819 and early 1820, negotiations produced the Treaty of Trujillo in November 1820, acknowledging Spanish weakness and creating space for patriot consolidation. Between 1820 and 1821, Bolívar secured control of Venezuela and New Granada, beginning operations toward Quito in present-day Ecuador. On May 24, 1821, General Antonio José de Sucre defeated Spanish forces at Battle of Pichincha, consolidating patriot control of highlands. In July 1821, the Congress of Cúcuta formally established the Republic of Gran Colombia, uniting Venezuela, New Granada, and Quito under centralized republican framework with Bolívar as president. The new republic represented most extensive territorial consolidation achieved by any independence leader in the Americas. Part 3. Legacy and meaning. After transforming Spanish America from unified colonial domain into collection of independent republics between 1813 and 1825, Bolívar now confronted far more difficult task of governing them. From 1821 onward, Bolívar served as president of Gran Colombia, attempting to bind Venezuela, New Granada, and Quito through centralized republican institutions. He established schools expanding literacy and republican education, reformed legal codes based on Enlightenment principles, and worked to limit slavery through decrees freeing enslaved soldiers and prohibiting slave trade. However, his commitment to abolition remained partial and strategic rather than categorical. It protected established slaveholders, property rights in compromise with regional elites, and never moved toward immediate comprehensive emancipation. Yet Bolívar's centralism created conditions for his undoing. Regional interests in Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador competed fiercely for resources and autonomy. José Antonio Páez, the Llanero commander essential to military success, increasingly chafed at subordination to centralized authority and regional favoritism. Beginning in April 1826, Páez's forces resisted centralized control, and by 1827 to 1828, Venezuela was effectively beyond Bolívar's direct authority. Bolívar suffered from chronic illness, likely tuberculosis, though historians dispute the exact cause, that progressively weakened him. By 1828, he had largely abandoned hope of maintaining continental union. It issued the Organic Decree in August 1828, granting himself dictatorial powers to govern by decree, a measure intended to preserve order but one alienating liberal republicans. By 1829, Bolívar's continental project had disintegrated. Gran Colombia fragmented into Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador as separate republics. Bolivia, though named in his honor, remained independent and faced chronic instability. Peru and Chile likewise fractured into competing factions. Regional federalism and strongman leadership increasingly dominated rather than centralized republicanism Bolívar attempted to impose. Bolívar formally resigned from all offices on April 27, 1830, embarking for Europe seeking recovery in temperate climate. He died in Santa Marta in present-day Colombia on December 17, 1830, in modest circumstances, having arrived as guest of Spanish official Joaquín de Mier but abandoned by most former allies. Bolívar's core philosophy rested on three interdependent principles. First, he believed Spanish America constituted natural geopolitical and cultural unit bound by shared language, religion, and historical experience, requiring centralized leadership to prevent fragmentation into competing states vulnerable to external domination or civil war. Second, he held that republican government based on popular sovereignty and constitutional limitation offered the only legitimate foundation for post-colonial states. However, he believed strong executive authority was necessary to establish order and institutional stability before liberal democratic participation could safely flourish. Third, he maintained that military virtue, discipline, sacrifice, strategic vision, and willingness to subordinate personal interest to collective liberation was prerequisite for political legitimacy in newly independent nations. In practice, Bolívar's career revealed fundamental tensions in his philosophy. His military campaigns liberated vast territories but required centralized command, alienating republicans committed to decentralized federalism. His abolition of slavery was sincere but incomplete, seeking to preserve slaveholder property while eliminating institution itself, compromise satisfying neither abolitionists nor slaveholders. His continental vision underestimated regional particularism and degree to which local elites valued autonomy over continental integration. Institutions he created proved insufficient to bind diverse territories under unified leadership, collapsing shortly after military pressure ended. Modern historians assess Bolívar's legacy as genuinely transformative but not as he envisioned. His military campaigns unquestionably ended Spanish imperial control of South America, feat numerous other leaders attempted and failed to achieve. A unified diverse populations across vast territories through force of personality, ideological consistency, and strategic genius unparalleled among independence leaders. Yet he embodied the paradox of military liberation. Structures necessary to defeat imperialism proved insufficient for governing stable republics. His continental dreams fragmented almost immediately upon military campaigns. Conclusion, revealing that military victory did not automatically translate into institutional legitimacy. What survives from Bolívar is complex and contested. His military tactics remain studied in academies worldwide as models of mobile warfare and strategic vision. His republicanism influenced legal frameworks across Latin America even when nations diverged sharply from his designs. His invocation of indigenous and enslaved peoples as constituent members of new republics, however incomplete his commitment, established in principle that these populations possessed political agency, notion later movements would extend radically. Yet his institutional creations rapidly collapsed, fragmenting within 5 years of his death. His personal authority did not transfer to stable institutions. The unresolved question, could continental unity have been preserved if Bolívar had more fully embraced federalism and decentralized authority, respecting regional autonomy rather than insisting on centralized executive control? The unforeseen consequence, Bolívar's military success in destroying Spanish imperial power inadvertently created conditions for North American economic and political expansion into the hemisphere. Outcome Bolívar warned against in final years, stating the United States appeared destined by Providence to plague the Americas with misery. Simón Bolívar remains central figure in Latin American independence because he demonstrated European imperial control of the Americas could be militarily reversed through coordinated strategy and ideological commitment to republicanism. His failures matter as much as victories in understanding how military liberation translated imperfectly into republican state building. For contemporary observers concerned with decolonization, institutional design, relationships between military force and legitimate governance, and maintaining unity across diverse territories, Bolívar exemplifies both necessity of armed resistance to imperialism and profound difficulty of converting military triumph into durable democratic institutions. His life illuminates enduring tensions between unity and diversity, centralization and federalism, military authority and republican governance, revolutionary ideals and pragmatic compromise.